Houston Harbor, July 7, 2020. Lines of metal containers roast beneath the Texas heat. Within one of them, $20 million in drug cartel currency awaiting its disappearance. Machinery groans above, hoisting boxes like playthings. Laborers navigate through the sweltering conditions, safety vests gleaming in the brightness. And within the darkness, a figure maneuvers a cart, watching his timepiece. He's merely a harbor laborer earning $15 hourly. However, tonight, he's preparing to rob the cartel and disappear without leaving any trail. Before I guide you through the complete narrative, I have a modest request to make. Please subscribe to our channel. Press that like button and inform me in the comments. Which city are you viewing from? It's consistently remarkable to witness how extensive this viewership has become. Miguel Alvarez stood at 39 and unnoticed in the manner working-class individuals frequently are, vital yet ignored. He matured in Beaumont, Texas, where industrial stacks dominated the horizon, and most males either departed for university or labored until their physiques failed. Miguel never possessed the initial choice. His father perished in an industrial accident when he reached 16, creating medical bills that eliminated the family's savings. His mother's diabetes rendered university unattainable. For 20 years, Miguel wandered through demanding employment, building work, petroleum fields, storage facilities, each one concluding identically, terminations, mechanization, or pledges of progression that never materialized. The Houston Harbor had symbolized security when Miguel was employed 3 years prior. The compensation was reasonable, $15 hourly with additional time possibilities that could elevate his weekly income beyond $700. The labor was consistent with sufficient diversity to avoid the numbing tedium that had defined his earlier warehouse positions. Most crucially, the harbor functioned 24 hours daily, generating shift premiums and overtime bonuses that enabled survival in a metropolis where housing consumes 60% of most laborers' earnings. Miguel performed the nighttime shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., controlling cranes and lifts that transfer shipping containers among trucks, trains, and freight ships. The Houston Harbor processed over 200,000 containers monthly, each representing global trade worth millions collectively. The magnitude was staggering: 36 miles of shipping channel, over 200 private docks, freight movements that continuously flowed through the industrial labyrinth. The intricacy generated possibilities for individuals who comprehended how to exploit structural weaknesses. Miguel had acquired this understanding progressively through observations that gathered over months of laboring in an environment where lawful commerce blended seamlessly with criminal operations. Miguel resided alone in a single-bedroom dwelling in Pasadena, Texas, a working-class community controlled by refineries and chemical facilities. The dwelling was neat but minimal: a bed on the ground, a television from 2015, a compact kitchen surface where he consumed meals alone while examining newspapers or viewing local broadcasts. His separation had been completed 2 years previously, terminating a union that had been ruined by monetary pressure, opposing work timetables, and Miguel's growing emotional detachment from difficulties he couldn't resolve. His former spouse, Carmen, had remarried a manager at a petrochemical facility, a person who could supply the security and emotional availability that Miguel had never succeeded in providing. Miguel didn't harbor resentment toward Carmen's choice. He recognized it was pragmatic rather than individual. However, the separation had burdened him with child maintenance duties for his 8-year-old daughter, Sophia, that consumed $800 of his monthly earnings, leaving him with scarcely sufficient funds for housing, services, and essential needs. Sophia resided with Carmen and her new stepfather in a residential home with a yard and quality schools, an existence that Miguel's earnings couldn't have supplied even during the finest periods of their union. Miguel visited his daughter every alternate weekend, bringing her to parks, galleries, and dining establishments he couldn't truly afford, attempting to condense a father's affection into 8 days monthly. Miguel's mother resided in a care facility in Beaumont, enduring diabetes-connected complications that demanded continuous medical monitoring. Her Medicare insurance covered essential care, but the facility was short-staffed and under-resourced, delivering limited attention to residents who couldn't afford private additional coverage. Miguel transmitted his mother $300 monthly, funds that enhanced her care slightly, but constituted a substantial sacrifice from his already stretched budget. The calculations of Miguel's existence were merciless, following taxes, child maintenance, his mother's care, housing, services, vehicle payments, and essential living costs. He typically possessed under $100 monthly for emergencies, vehicle repairs, medical costs, or any unforeseen expenses that might occur. He existed in persistent worry about financial disaster, a malfunction that would cost beyond his means, a medical crisis that would ruin his credit, or any interruption to his employment that would initiate a sequence of unpayable obligations. However, Miguel was encircled by riches that flowed through his hands daily. The Houston harbor was a channel for international trade worth billions annually. Container vessels arrived from Asia transporting consumer products intended for Walmart and Amazon storage facilities. Oil vessels departed for Europe loaded with processed petroleum goods. Bulk transporters carried grain to Africa and South America, returning with raw materials that supplied American production, and concealed within this lawful commerce was a parallel system that Miguel had started noticing during his second year of employment. The initial indication had been the containers that avoided standard inspection processes. Every shipping container that accessed the Houston harbor was expected to follow established procedures, customs examinations, manifest evaluations, weight confirmations, and security checks intended to prevent smuggling, terrorism, and tax avoidance. However, certain containers progressed through the system with limited examination, handled by managers who appeared unusually eager to accelerate their processing. These particular containers arrived on designated ships, consistently during nighttime shifts when federal inspection crews were functioning with skeleton staffs. The containers were labeled with authentic shipping company emblems and possessed proper paperwork, but experienced harbor workers identified subtle variations in their handling methods. Miguel had mastered identifying the particular containers through details that weren't apparent to casual witnesses. The documentation was consistently perfect, excessively perfect, with none of the minor inconsistencies, modifications, or irregular markings that characterize authentic international shipping. The container codes followed sequences that didn't correspond to the coding structures used by major shipping companies. Most significantly, the containers were managed by particular crews who alternated assignments to ensure that no individual worker witnessed too many of these particular movements. The containers journeyed in both directions. Southward containers allegedly transported industrial equipment or automotive components intended for plants in Mexico and Central America. Northward containers supposedly contained agricultural goods or fabrics from the identical regions. However, the weight distributions were incorrect for the declared contents, and the shipping timetables didn't correspond to the seasonal patterns that authentic agricultural commerce would follow. Miguel had observed inside one of these containers during a standard inspection that happened when regular managers were unavailable due to a scheduling issue. Rather than industrial equipment, the container contained dozens of wooden boxes, secured with steel straps and warning signs in Spanish. The boxes were consistent in dimensions, professionally built, and heavier than their measurement suggested they should be. A senior harbor worker named Carlos had rapidly closed the container and relocated it to a different processing zone, but not before cautioning Miguel to forget what he had witnessed. "Certain matters are better left undisturbed," Carlos had stated. "We transport what's on the manifest, no inquiries asked." That's how we maintain our employment. Miguel had discovered through careful observation and overheard discussions that the Houston harbor was being utilized as a currency laundering operation by Mexican cartels. Narcotics traveled north through established smuggling channels, producing enormous profits that required conversion into assets that could flow through lawful financial structures. Currency was bulky, challenging to transport, and impossible to deposit in banks without activating federal reporting obligations. The solution was to transport the currency through harbors, where it could be disguised as trade payments, export income, or business dealings that appeared lawful to regulatory officials. The Houston harbor was perfect for this intention because of its massive lawful volume. Millions of lawful dealings provided ideal camouflage for criminal financial flows. The southward containers transported currency, likely hundreds of thousands or millions per container, vacuum-sealed and disguised as lawful cargo. The currency would be transported to Mexico, where it could be utilized to purchase assets, pay bribes, or fund operations without generating electronic records that American law enforcement could trace. The northward containers likely transported narcotics, but Miguel had never witnessed direct evidence of this portion of the operation. The containers, he noticed, were processed rapidly and transported immediately to destinations throughout the United States, distributed through networks that were invisible to lawful authorities. Miguel calculated that he witnessed these particular containers roughly twice monthly, typically during weekend shifts when federal supervision was minimal. If each container transported $5 million in currency, a conservative calculation based on the weight and packaging he had witnessed, the cartel was laundering at minimum $10 million monthly through the Houston harbor alone. The operation was sophisticated, well-coordinated, and protected by corruption that extended throughout the harbor's administrative framework. Security personnel were compensated to ignore irregularities. Managers received bonuses for expediting certain deliveries. Federal inspectors were systematically avoided through scheduling manipulations and bureaucratic delays. Miguel was earning $15 hourly to facilitate an operation that transported millions weekly. The emergency commenced in March 2020, when Miguel's mother was hospitalized with diabetic complications that required urgent surgery. The operation was successful, but her recovery demanded extended rehabilitation in a private facility that provided superior care than her standard nursing home. The additional expense would be $2,000 monthly for at minimum 6 months, funds that Miguel didn't possess and couldn't borrow. Concurrently, Miguel's vehicle was repossessed when he fell behind on payments after using his vehicle payment funds to cover his mother's medical costs. Without dependable transportation, Miguel confronted the possibility of losing his position at the harbor, which would trigger a cascade of financial catastrophes, including eviction, defaulted child maintenance, and his mother's return to inadequate medical care. Miguel's former wife, Carmen, contacted to inform him that Sophia required dental treatment that would cost $1,500. The child's insurance would cover basic procedures, but Sophia needed orthodontic treatment that was considered cosmetic rather than medically essential. Carmen's new husband was willing to pay for the treatment, but Carmen wanted Miguel to contribute as a matter of paternal duty. Miguel's credit accounts were maximized. His bank account contained $47. He possessed no family members who could provide loans, no assets that could be sold for immediate cash, and no realistic possibility of earning additional income through lawful employment. Meanwhile, every week, Miguel observed millions in cartel currency pass through his workplace, handled by individuals who treated money like an unlimited resource. The contrast was overwhelming. Miguel couldn't afford to repair his daughter's teeth, while criminals casually transported sufficient cash to resolve every financial difficulty he would ever encounter. The notion of theft had occurred to Miguel months earlier, but he had dismissed it as fantasy. Stealing from a cartel would be suicide. These organizations possessed unlimited resources for tracking down thieves, sophisticated networks for locating individuals who attempted to disappear, and reputations for violence that discouraged most rational individuals from considering robbery. However, Miguel's situation was no longer rational. He was drowning in difficulties that couldn't be resolved through hard labor, careful budgeting, or traditional responses to financial emergency. He required a large amount of funds quickly, and there was only one source of such funds within his reach. Miguel began studying the cartel operation with the systematic attention of a person who understood that one error would be his last. Miguel spent 3 months observing the currency laundering operation before he touched anything or altered his routine in any detectable manner. He discovered that the cash-filled containers arrived roughly every 3 weeks, consistently on ships that docked during weekend shifts when federal inspection teams functioned with minimal staffing. The containers followed predictable sequences. They arrived on vessels operated by shipping companies that were lawful businesses, but obviously compromised by cartel influence. The containers were processed by particular managers who expedited their movement through customs procedures using techniques that avoided detailed inspections. Most importantly, Miguel identified the storage and handling procedures that generated opportunities for theft. The containers spent 12 to 48 hours in the harbor's temporary storage zones while awaiting ground transportation to their final destinations. During this period, they were secured but not under constant surveillance. Miguel discovered that a particularly valuable shipment was scheduled to arrive on July 7, 2020. The container was supposedly transporting industrial pump equipment intended for a factory in Veracruz, Mexico, but harbor workers who had handled similar shipments estimated it contained roughly $20 million in currency. The container would arrive on a Tuesday evening and remain in temporary storage until Thursday morning, when it would be loaded onto a truck for transport to the Mexican border. The 40-hour window provided time for Miguel to execute a plan that had been developing in his mind for months. Miguel's strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than stealing the currency directly, he would replace the entire container with an identical decoy that would fool casual inspection, but contain worthless cargo. The real container would disappear from the harbor's inventory system, but the theft wouldn't be discovered until the container reached its destination in Mexico, days later. By the time the cartel realized they had been robbed, Miguel would be hundreds of miles away with sufficient funds to disappear permanently. Miguel acquired an empty shipping container from a storage zone designated for containers awaiting repair or disposal. These containers were considered scrap material, temporarily removed from active service, but not yet processed for sale or destruction. Miguel selected a container that matched the approximate dimensions and configuration of the target container, then spent weeks modifying its appearance to create a convincing replica. He purchased spray paint and stencils from hardware stores throughout Houston, paying cash and varying his shopping locations to avoid creating patterns that investigators might later trace. Working during his days off, Miguel carefully reproduced the shipping company logos, container identification numbers, and customs markings that would make his decoy indistinguishable from the original. The most challenging aspect was matching the weight. The cash-filled container would weigh significantly more than an empty container, and weight discrepancies might trigger suspicions during routine handling procedures. Miguel filled his decoy container with scrap metal, concrete blocks, and industrial waste that approximated the weight and weight distribution of the cash-filled container. Miguel also prepared his escape route. He arranged to borrow a truck from his cousin, Roberto, who operated a small construction business and understood the importance of discretion when family members needed help with problems they couldn't discuss in detail. Roberto asked no questions about Miguel's plans, accepting a story about gambling debts and the need to relocate quickly to avoid creditors. Miguel rented a warehouse facility 20 miles from the harbor, paying 6 months in advance using funds borrowed against his credit cards. The warehouse was located in an industrial area with minimal surveillance, providing a secure location where he could process the stolen container without observation. Most importantly, Miguel developed a plan for converting the stolen cash into assets that could be transported and concealed during his flight from the United States. He researched currency exchange procedures, banking regulations in Central American countries, and smuggling routes that could move large amounts of money across international borders without triggering regulatory oversight. July 7, 2020, 11:47 p.m. The Houston harbor functioned under a canopy of sodium lights that transformed the industrial landscape into an orange-tinted maze of shadows and brilliant illumination. A summer thunderstorm was building over the Gulf of Mexico, sending occasional lightning flashes across the sky and filling the air with the humid electricity that preceded heavy rain. Miguel had been monitoring the target container since its arrival 6 hours earlier. The container was positioned in Storage Area C, a section of the harbor designated for temporary storage of containers awaiting ground transportation. The area was secured by chain-link fencing and monitored by security cameras, but the overnight shift operated with minimal staffing and guards, who were more concerned with preventing intrusion than observing routine cargo movements. The container sat among dozens of similar containers, distinguishable only by its identification numbers and the subtle markings that indicated its special status within the cartel's transportation network. To casual observers, it appeared identical to legitimate cargo containers containing machinery, consumer goods, or raw materials destined for international markets. But Miguel knew that inside this unremarkable metal box were vacuum-sealed packages containing approximately $20 million in United States currency. Small denomination bills bundled with rubber bands, heat-sealed in plastic, and arranged on wooden pallets that could be moved with standard forklift equipment. At midnight, Miguel began his routine shift duties, operating a crane that moved containers between storage areas and transportation staging zones. His work assignment included Storage Area C, providing legitimate access to the section where the target container was located. Miguel had arranged his shift schedule months in advance to ensure he would be working when the container arrived, using vacation days and shift swaps to create the perfect opportunity. Miguel's plan required precise timing, coordinated with the predictable patterns of harbor security. The overnight guards conducted roving patrols every 30 minutes, following established routes that took them away from Storage Area C for approximately 15 minutes during each cycle. Security cameras covered the main access roads and entry points, but created blind spots in areas where routine cargo movements wouldn't attract attention. At 12:23 a.m., Miguel used his crane to lift the target container from its designated storage location. To anyone observing, this appeared to be a routine cargo movement. Containers were frequently repositioned during overnight shifts to accommodate arriving shipments or prepare for morning transportation schedules. Miguel transported the container to a maintenance area behind Building 7, a section of the harbor used for equipment repairs and temporary storage of materials needed for routine operations. This area was poorly lit, rarely visited during overnight shifts, and shielded from direct observation by larger buildings and equipment. Working quickly but carefully, Miguel used a portable forklift to move his prepared decoy container into position. The decoy was identical in appearance to the original. Same dimensions, same markings, same apparent weight. Miguel had practiced this container swap dozens of times during previous shifts, timing each movement and memorizing the precise procedures needed to complete the exchange without attracting attention. At 12:41 a.m., Miguel lifted the decoy container with his crane and transported it to the original storage location in Area C. The substitution was complete. The decoy now occupied the position designated for the cartel's cash shipment, While the real container containing $20 million was hidden in the maintenance area, Miguel resumed his normal work duties, moving other containers and completing routine tasks that justified his presence throughout the harbor facility. Security cameras recorded his activities, but showed only a conscientious employee performing standard overnight operations. At 2:15 a.m., during a scheduled break in the security patrol pattern, Miguel used a different forklift to move the stolen container from the maintenance area to a loading dock where his cousin Roberto waited with a flatbed truck. The loading process took 8 minutes, longer than Miguel had hoped, but still within acceptable parameters for avoiding detection. Roberto asked no questions about the container's contents or Miguel's reasons for needing immediate transportation. He had agreed to help his cousin move equipment to a storage facility, accepting payment of $5,000 cash without requiring detailed explanations about the cargo's nature or legal status. At 2:31 a.m., the truck departed the Houston harbor, carrying $20 million in stolen cartel money. Miguel returned to his shift duties, completing his work assignment and clocking out at 7 a.m. as scheduled. To all observers, he had worked a normal overnight shift, moving containers and performing routine operations that were documented by time cards, equipment logs, and security footage. The theft was perfect in its invisibility. The decoy container would be loaded onto a truck Thursday morning and transported to Mexico, where the substitution wouldn't be discovered until the container was opened at its final destination. By that time, Miguel would be hundreds of miles away, and the trail connecting him to the theft would be impossible to follow. Miguel and Roberto drove the stolen container to the rented warehouse, arriving at 3:47 a.m., while Houston slept under the approaching thunderstorm. The warehouse was located in an industrial district where late-night truck movements were common and wouldn't attract attention from neighbors or security services. The warehouse was spacious enough to accommodate the 40-foot container with room for the equipment needed to process its contents. Miguel had prepared the facility over several weeks, installing portable lighting, ventilation fans, and security measures that would allow him to work without observation or interruption. Breaking the container seal required bolt cutters and crowbars, but the process was straightforward for someone familiar with standard shipping container construction. Miguel had practiced opening similar containers during his harbor employment, learning the techniques needed to access cargo without damaging valuable contents. Inside the container, Miguel found exactly what he had expected: wooden pallets stacked with packages wrapped in heavy plastic and sealed with industrial tape. The packages were uniform in size and weight, professionally prepared for transportation through international commerce networks. Each package contained approximately $100,000 in mixed denomination bills, bundled with rubber bands and vacuum sealed to prevent moisture damage during ocean transport. The total contents represented approximately $20 million, making this the largest single theft in the history of cartel operations in Texas. Miguel was holding more money than most people would earn during their entire lifetimes. Cash that could solve every financial problem he had ever faced and provide security for his daughter's future, but the money was also a death sentence if the cartel discovered his identity. Miguel understood that he had perhaps 72 hours before the theft was discovered, and maybe another week before cartel investigators identified him as the likely perpetrator. After that, every day he remained alive would depend on staying ahead of people who had unlimited resources for tracking down their enemies. Miguel divided the money into two portions. He kept $15 million for himself, enough to disappear permanently and establish a new life in a country where the cartel's influence was limited. He gave Roberto $5 million as payment for his assistance and his silence about the night's activities. Roberto was shocked by the amount of money involved, but he was also a practical man who understood that asking questions about the source would serve no useful purpose. He accepted his share of the money, helped Miguel load the remaining cash into rental vehicles, and agreed to dispose of the empty container using methods that would prevent its discovery by law enforcement. By dawn, the warehouse had been cleaned and abandoned. The container was being transported to a scrapyard where it would be destroyed and recycled into unidentifiable metal. The rental agreement was paid in full using untraceable cash, and Miguel had disappeared from Houston with enough money to remain invisible for the rest of his life. Miguel had planned his disappearance with the same systematic attention he had devoted to the theft itself. He understood that the cartel would eventually identify him as a suspect, and that staying in the United States would be impossible once his name appeared on their target list. Miguel's escape route took him south through Texas toward the Mexican border, following highways that carried heavy commercial traffic, where a single vehicle wouldn't attract attention from law enforcement agencies. He had prepared multiple vehicles and safe houses, creating a network of resources that would allow him to stay ahead of both cartel hunters and federal investigators. His first stop was a truck stop near San Antonio, where he transferred the money from Roberto's construction truck to a rental car that had been reserved using false identification. The rental car was inconspicuous but reliable, capable of covering long distances without mechanical problems that might force him to interact with police or mechanics. Miguel drove through the night, reaching the Texas-Mexico border at Laredo as the sun rose over the Rio Grande. He had researched border crossing procedures extensively, identifying checkpoints that process commercial traffic with minimal scrutiny of individual travelers who appeared to be conducting legitimate business. Crossing into Mexico required carefully prepared documentation and plausible explanations for his travel. Miguel presented himself as a construction contractor investigating business opportunities in Mexican industrial cities, carrying proposals and contracts that justified his presence without creating records that investigators could later trace. Once in Mexico, Miguel had access to smuggling networks that specialized in moving people and money throughout Central America without government oversight. These networks operated with the knowledge and cooperation of the same cartels he had robbed, but they were businessmen first and criminals second. They would transport anyone who could pay their fees, regardless of their conflicts with other criminal organizations. Miguel paid $100,000 cash for passage to Guatemala, traveling with a group of businessmen and professionals who were relocating for reasons they preferred not to discuss with authorities. The smugglers provided false documentation, transportation in vehicles that avoided official checkpoints, and accommodation in safe houses where travelers could rest while their paperwork was processed. From Guatemala, Miguel continued south to Honduras, a country where government authority was limited in rural areas and where cash could purchase complete invisibility from both legal and illegal threats. Miguel had researched Honduran geography extensively, identifying regions where the central government had minimal presence and where local populations were accustomed to people who preferred to avoid official attention. By July 15th, 8 days after the theft, Miguel had settled in a small town in the mountains near the Salvadoran border. He purchased a modest house using cash and established himself as a businessman from the United States who was investing in local agriculture and small manufacturing. The story was plausible. His Spanish was fluent, and his money provided credibility with local officials who were accustomed to foreign investors seeking opportunities in developing regions. Miguel's new identity was supported by documentation purchased from the same networks that had facilitated his escape from the United States. His new name, background, and personal history were constructed well enough to satisfy routine inquiries, but wouldn't survive detailed investigation by serious law enforcement agencies. But Honduras was a country where serious law enforcement rarely penetrated rural areas and where foreign criminals could live comfortably as long as they avoided activities that threatened local power structures or attracted international attention. The cartel discovered the theft on July 10th when their container arrived at its destination in Veracruz and was opened to reveal scrap metal instead of $20 million in cash. The discovery triggered an immediate crisis response that mobilized the organization's most experienced investigators and enforcers. The initial assumption was internal betrayal. Someone within the transportation network had replaced the cash with worthless cargo, probably in cooperation with rival criminal organizations or corrupt government officials. This type of theft required detailed knowledge of the operation, access to containers during transit, and resources sufficient to execute a sophisticated deception. The cartel's investigators began systematic interrogations of everyone who had handled the container during its journey from Houston to Veracruz. Mexican harbor workers were questioned first, using techniques that extracted information quickly but often resulted in the deaths of people who had no knowledge of the theft. 2 workers at the Veracruz facility disappeared after providing information about the container's arrival and processing. Their bodies were never found, but their fates served as a warning to other employees about the consequences of cooperating with investigators who suspected them of theft or deception. The investigation expanded to include transportation personnel who had moved the container between the harbor and its storage facility. Truck drivers, security guards, and supervisors were interrogated using methods that were designed to break psychological resistance rather than establish factual guilt or innocence. Within 72 hours, the cartel's investigators had determined that the theft had occurred in Houston rather than Mexico. The container had arrived in Veracruz with its original seals intact, suggesting that the substitution had been made before the container departed the United States. This discovery triggered a parallel investigation in Houston, conducted by enforcers who specialized in operating within United States territory without attracting attention from federal law enforcement agencies. These investigators had access to harbor employment records, shipping documentation, and surveillance footage that could identify everyone who had access to the container during its time in Houston. The manhunt, the cartel's investigation in Houston, was led by a man known as El Contador, the accountant, whose specialty was tracking missing money and eliminating people who had stolen from criminal organizations. El Contador was methodical, patient, and absolutely ruthless in his pursuit of financial crimes that threatened cartel operations. El Contador's team began by analyzing harbor security footage covering the period when the container had been in temporary storage. The footage showed routine cargo movements, but careful analysis revealed subtle irregularities in container positioning that suggested unauthorized handling. The investigators identified Miguel Alvarez as a suspect when they discovered that he had operated the crane used to move containers in the storage area where the theft had occurred. Miguel's work records showed that he had been on duty during the critical time period and had access to equipment needed to execute the container substitution. But identifying Miguel as a suspect was easier than locating him for interrogation. When El Contador's team arrived at Miguel's apartment on July 12th, they found it empty and cleaned of personal belongings. Miguel had disappeared, leaving behind only basic furniture and no forwarding address. The investigation expanded to include Miguel's known associates, family members, and anyone who might have information about his current location. El Contador's team interrogated Miguel's ex-wife, his former co-workers, and neighbors who might have observed suspicious activities or conversations. Carmen, Miguel's ex-wife, was questioned extensively about her former husband's financial problems, work complaints, and any indications that he might have been planning criminal activities. She truthfully reported that Miguel had been struggling with money, but had never discussed plans for theft or violence. Carmen's new husband was also questioned and released after providing alibi information that confirmed his lack of involvement. Miguel's cousin, Roberto, was identified as a potential accomplice when investigators discovered his connection to Miguel and his access to transportation equipment that could have been used in the theft. Roberto was kidnapped from his construction business and subjected to intensive interrogation designed to extract information about Miguel's whereabouts and the location of the stolen money. Roberto survived the interrogation by providing partial information that satisfied his captors without betraying Miguel's complete escape plan. He admitted to helping Miguel move a container, but claimed he had believed it contained legitimate cargo that Miguel was relocating for business reasons. Roberto insisted he had no knowledge of stolen money or Miguel's current location. The cartel's investigators accepted Roberto's story after determining that he lacked the sophistication and resources needed to plan or execute a $20 million heist theft. They released him after breaking several bones and permanently damaging his hearing, injuries that served as warnings to other potential accomplices about the consequences of cooperation with thieves. The FBI became involved in the investigation when intelligence sources reported unusual cartel activity in the Houston area. The sudden disappearance of several harbor workers, combined with reports of aggressive interrogations being conducted by Mexican criminal organizations, suggested that a significant crime had occurred within federal jurisdiction. Agent Maria Santos was assigned to lead the federal task force investigating the harbor theft. Santos was a 15-year veteran of financial crimes investigations who specialized in currency laundering operations conducted by international criminal organizations. She understood that traditional investigative methods would be limited in cases involving cartels that operated outside normal legal constraints. Santos's investigation faced immediate obstacles. The theft had been conducted with professional skill that left minimal physical evidence. The security footage showed routine harbor operations, but no obvious criminal activity. The suspected victim, the cartel, couldn't report the crime to legitimate authorities without admitting to currency laundering activities that would trigger federal prosecutions. The FBI's investigation relied primarily on intelligence gathered from informants within the criminal community and surveillance of known cartel associates operating in the Houston area. Santos's team identified the currency laundering operation that had been using the Houston harbor as a processing center, but they couldn't establish direct connections between this operation and the specific theft that had triggered the cartel's violent response. Miguel Alvarez was identified as a person of interest when the FBI analyzed harbor employment records and discovered his sudden disappearance after years of stable employment, but circumstantial evidence wasn't sufficient for federal charges, and Miguel's location remained unknown despite extensive efforts to trace his movements after leaving Houston. The investigation was further complicated by jurisdictional issues that arose when Miguel's escape route crossed international borders. The FBI could investigate crimes committed within the United States, but they couldn't pursue suspects who had fled to countries that didn't have extradition treaties or cooperative law enforcement relationships. Santos's investigation remained active for 18 months before being transferred to a cold case unit with limited resources and no dedicated personnel. The FBI's final report concluded that an unknown person had stolen an undetermined amount of money from a Mexican criminal organization and that the perpetrator had most likely fled the United States to avoid prosecution. The cartel's investigation continued long after the FBI had suspended active pursuit of the case. El Contador's team spent more than $500,000 during 2 years of searching for Miguel Alvarez, following leads throughout the United States, Mexico, and Central America. The investigation included systematic searches of immigration records, financial transactions, and surveillance footage from border crossings between the United States and Mexico. The cartel's investigators had access to corrupt officials within multiple government agencies who could provide information that wouldn't be available to legitimate law enforcement. But Miguel's escape had been planned with sufficient care to defeat even sophisticated pursuit efforts. His false identification documents were high quality enough to pass routine inspection, and his financial transactions were conducted using methods that didn't create electronic records accessible to investigators. The cartel eventually located Miguel's general area of refuge in rural Honduras, but they were unable to pinpoint his exact location or identity within the local community. Honduras was a country where the cartel had limited operational presence and where their investigators couldn't operate with the same freedom they enjoyed in Mexico or parts of the United States. Local Honduran criminals who were approached for assistance in locating Miguel demanded payment that exceeded the value of recovering the stolen money. The cartel's leadership eventually concluded that continued pursuit would be economically irrational, especially since Miguel had demonstrated no intention of returning to criminal activities that might threaten their operations. The cartel's final decision was to post a $1 million bounty for information leading to Miguel's capture, but to suspend active investigation efforts after 2 years of unsuccessful searching. The bounty remained active as a warning to other potential thieves, but no serious resources were dedicated to enforcement. Miguel Alvarez has not been seen or credibly identified since July 2020. Intelligence agencies maintain inactive files on his case, but no government has dedicated significant resources to locating him or investigating his current activities. The cartel that lost $20 million to his theft has moved their currency laundering operations to different facilities and implemented security measures designed to prevent similar thefts. There are occasional unconfirmed reports of Miguel's activities in Central America. Sightings of a man matching his description, conducting business in rural communities, purchasing property with cash, or investing in local enterprises that provide employment and economic development. But none of these reports have been verified by reliable sources or resulted in confirmed identification. Law enforcement analysts have developed several theories about Miguel's current status. He may have been killed by cartel enforcers who found him but chose not to report their success to avoid questions about their operational methods. He may have died from natural causes while hiding in regions with limited medical care. He may have successfully established a new identity and integrated into a community where his past remains unknown. Or he may be living exactly where he planned to be from the beginning, in a small town in the mountains of Honduras, supporting his daughter's education through anonymous financial transfers and occasionally remembering the night he walked away from the Houston harbor with $20 million in stolen cartel money. Intelligence agencies occasionally receive reports of large cash transactions in Central American communities that might indicate Miguel's presence, but these reports are typically too vague or unreliable to justify expensive investigation efforts. Miguel's case has become a cautionary tale used in law enforcement training programs about the challenges of investigating crimes committed by organized criminal groups that can't report their losses to legitimate authorities. The truth about Miguel Alvarez's fate remains locked in silence, protected by geography, false documentation, and the practical limitations that prevent law enforcement agencies from pursuing suspects who have successfully disappeared into countries where government authority is limited and cash can purchase absolute invisibility. One harbor worker earning $15 hourly had defeated a billion-dollar criminal organization through careful planning, precise execution, and the courage to risk everything on a single night of opportunity. Whether he survived to enjoy his victory or paid the ultimate price for his audacity remains one of the unsolved mysteries of modern crime. If you enjoyed this narrative, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next episode.